First of all, I don't know how many times I've spoken at ISEPP, but it's always a great pleasure and honor, so thank you for having me here. When David contacted me and he's talked about the theme of this particular conference, I was so happy because it raises this big picture issue that I think is so important to us in society today. I think there's few issues as important as sort of the place of psychiatry in society today and how it has changed our society over the past 30, 40 years and how we might move forward from this moment. And let me just begin by saying how much I agreed with Dr. Francis that this current system is a mess and that it's doing great harm to our society at many, many different levels, starting with our children. And what I'd like to do in the next 25 minutes, though, is chart a course of how we got here and then how we might change going forward. Now, 3 years ago, and the lens I'm going to do this through is a lens called institutional corruption. So 3 years ago, I was invited to be a fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Research Center for Studying Institutional Corruption at Harvard University. And here was the basic framework that was being put together at this lab. The idea with studying institutional corruptions, you look at institutional corruption, you look at institutions that have a public mission, such as Congress, and then you try to identify the economies of influence, and basically financial forces, et cetera, that cause that institution to betray its public mission. Now, Congress is the example that is the director of this lab is Lawrence Lessig, and he wrote a book about how Congress has been corrupted in this manner by lobbyists. So, of course, our representatives are supposed to represent us, the people, and instead, because of all the money coming from lobbyists into Congress and the need to raise money, our representatives end up beholden to the lobbyists. Anyway, I was asked to look at the American Psychiatric Association and academic psychiatry through this lens of institutional corruption. Now, here's the framework for it. You do identify the public mission, and of course, the public mission of any medical discipline is to serve the public and to serve the public health. Then you look at the economies of influence that may be causing that institution to stray from that mission, and I think it's pretty easy to identify the two economies of influence that have happened in psychiatry. Of course, it's pharmaceutical money, that's one. But actually the influence, the economy of influence that I think is even more profound and needs to be investigated is in fact the profession's guild interests. Its interest in promoting psychiatry itself, and we'll trace this. And then in this framework, once you sort of identify the economies of influence that are causing an institution to go astray, you look at the corrupting behavior. Oh, and by the way, one of the thoughts here is, one of the understandings is, or the beginning points is, the institutions you're going to say are populated by good people. So this is not an effort to demonize anybody, precisely the opposite. You're trying to look at what happens within that institution, what sort of framework happens that good people go astray. So anyway, then the next thing is, after you identify these economies of influence, you look at the corrupt behavior, then you look at the social injury from that corrupt behavior. Then you look at why don't the people in that institution see the corruption? And then finally you say, what are the solutions? How do we have this institution that is so important in society? How can we neutralize those economies of influence and thus create an institution that once again serves the public? So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes now is really look at the guild interest and how that economy of influence has shaped psychiatry, and in fact, I think led in part to this horrible situation we have today, in which we do have an institution that I think is causing great harm to our society, and I think societies elsewhere. So if you look at the rise of the Guild of American Psychiatric Association, it comes in two steps. If we go back to the early 1800s, we get asylums initially founded by Quakers, and the roots of that actually go to York, England. You have a group of Quakers there that are unhappy with mad medicine as practiced by doctors, and they say, well, we know that this aggressive medical therapies aren't working, but let's just build retreats, a retreat out in the countryside, and see if we can build a place that is comfortable and nurturing in this way, and maybe we can assist nature and God in helping people get well. Quakers in the United States adopt this model. They begin opening moral therapy asylums. But then very early on in the United States is physicians moved in. And they said, listen, maybe if we had these moral therapy asylums where you had a doctor plus this supportive therapy, you'd get better care. And this is the first sort of moment that physicians assert authority over a certain group of patients, etc. And the superintendents of these asylums in 1844 form an association of medical superintendents for the insane, and this becomes the group that then grows into the American Psychiatric Association. So this is the moment that psychiatry asserts control over the mad, the seriously mentally ill. And basically, for the next 100 years, that's their domain in our society. It's over the institutionalized mentally ill. Then after World War II, however, of course, Freud has come along. Freud, with his theories of neurosis, etc., offers psychiatry a way out of the asylum. And then after World War II, what happens? We have a lot of soldiers coming back, and there's a new sense that there's a lot of walking wounded out there, people who can function in society but are still struggling with, neurosis, anxiety, that sort of thing. So at this moment, psychiatry begins to move its way out of the asylum, begins to offer talk therapy, and now it's expanding its domain to include the less severely ill, in fact, the walking wounded, and even, quote, the normal. So from the 1950s and 1960s, you see this happening. You see more psychiatrists working out in the environment, out in the community. And basically, they're practicing with a combination of talk therapy plus the new drugs that come along, the new antidepressants, the benzodiazepines. Now, what happens in the 1970s? In the 1970s, psychiatry feels it's facing a crisis. And you can even read where they say, we're threatened with extinction, we're under siege, and what's going on? Well, one, you do have an anti-psychiatry movement, comes actually out of the, first it comes out of an academic environment, which says, and this actually questions their control over the mad, the hospitals. And they say, you're really acting as a police, a social control, and your hospitals, in fact, end up leading people to learned helplessness, all that. So that's the first threat is even over their hospitals. And then their second threat is over the walking wounded in the 1970s. And this threat comes from insurance companies saying, are your talk therapy really effective? Are they any better than these lower paying things we do by social workers or psychologists? Is your therapy any better than your competitors? And there was also, of course, a question of, are your diagnoses reliable and valid? And you can read, what are we going to do as a profession, as a guild, to move forward and sort of move out of this time of crisis? Now, there is one impulse that you can trace that's a scientific impulse, and that comes out of Washington University, and they say, listen, we're gonna make some hypotheses about different mental disorders, and if we have these hypotheses, and we'll put them in a diagnostic manual, and now we can test them to see if they're valid. And the idea is, at least if we group them, we'll make them more reliable. That's one impulse. But the second impulse is a guild impulse. And they say, how can we really assert authority over this domain and also establish a better credibility with the public? And you can see in different material, they say, what is the profession in America that has such prestige? It's doctors, right? So if we put on the white coat, that gives us a greater prestige. And also, they look to compare themselves with the social workers and the psychologists and the counselors, and they say, what do we have? What authority do we have in society that separates us from them in terms of what product can we provide that they can't? And of course, it's prescribing powers. So what happens in 1980? We get DSM-3, and with DSM-1 and DSM-2, that's a diagnostic manual that has some Freudian concepts of neurosis, etc. In 1980, it's not that the APA adopts a medical model. That's not accurate, I don't think. They adopt a disease model. And what they say is, we're going to have these different constructs of behaviors, feelings, etc. And of course, there's hundreds of them. And we're going to say those are symptoms of a disease. That's what we're going to declare. Now, the moment they do this, what are they doing? They're asserting domain over a very large segment of the population, and they're basically saying we get to we get to set the boundaries of that domain, because we can construct. We'll sit together in groups and we'll construct and say, if you have these distressing feelings, you can now qualify for a diagnosis. So after 1980, what are the 3 products that APA has in the sort of therapeutic marketplace? The one domain is in fact diagnosis, okay? Because if these are diseases, of course you're going to have medical doctors that construct those diagnoses. The second is research into what? The diseases, because this is the new understanding of mental problems, emotional distress. And the third, of course, is prescribing drugs, and this becomes their products in the medical marketplace. Talk therapy is now ceded to the psychologists and counselors, really. Next step, what does the APA start doing in 1980 going forward? They start selling this model to the American public. And you can see in 1980, for example, they start saying, well, first of all, they beef up their public relations department. The American Psychiatric Association Press has started to help sort of publish scientific findings around this new model. And you can even see, and this will help promote it to the public. They begin training their doctors. They begin running sessions and telling their doctors what to say, the psychiatrists, to say to the public. To tell this story of mental problems that are in essence diseases. And of course, we're going to go forward. But it is to sell this new model. And you can read the famous book by The Broken Brain by Nancy Andreas, and she says this. She says, these things are like, cancer, heart conditions, etc. They're diseases of the brain, just like we have these other diseases of the body. And very quickly, and they say, we're going to court the media. And we're going to start having media sessions every year to say that these are diseases of the brain, and we're making great progress in uncovering the molecules that are related to it. And they began awarding media members with awards if they sort of echoed this story. And by 1985, 5 years after this big change in our society, where we will now conceive of anxiety and depression and fidgety kids as diseases, there's a reporter for the Baltimore paper, John Franklin, who wins a a Pulitzer Prize for a series on this great advances in psychiatry, this extraordinary revolution unfolding. And they talk about psychiatrists that are identifying the molecules responsible for depression, the molecules for anxiety. And they said, like these great masters, they're going to be able to manipulate these molecules and basically give you the brain you want. And by the way, when you start now tracking the annual presentations by the presidents of the APA, you hear this same story. We're making such extraordinary progress. Has any field discovered as much as we have in the past 4 years? We are uncovering the biology of mental disorders. Now, that selling of that story has never stopped. Because after that, you will see they begin running educational campaigns over and over again as new drugs come to market. Say, as Prozac comes to market, what's the campaign? Depression is under-recognized, under-treated, and we have these very effective drugs for treating this disease. And you can see this over and over again. ADHD, it's under-recognized, under-treated, and we have these very effective treatments. And this goes on until today. You can track that there has been continual public education programs to sell this model to the American public ever since 1980. And it has been extraordinarily successful. Something like 80% of Americans now know that chemical imbalances cause mental disorders. So that is a very successful selling of this story. Now, real quickly on the chemical imbalance story, think about this. What does the chemical imbalance story tell us? A, that research has uncovered the biology of mental disorders. And remember, if we go back, what are the 3 products of psychiatry? Diagnosis. When they make these diagnoses, what do they have to do? They have to validate them as real disorders. when they do that in DSM-3. The chemical imbalance story says we've validated them. We did that. We identified the etiology of the disorders, and now the drugs, since they fix chemical imbalances, we have like antibiotics for these disorders or insulin for diabetes. Now, if that's true, that is a story of extraordinary progress. We all know how incredibly complex the brain is, and we heard that psychiatry figured it out. We know what causes depression. We know what causes schizophrenia. We know what causes ADHD, and we have things that fix that. But think about how this does well for the guild interests. It tells of progress in validated diagnosis, progress in research, and very effective treatments. And that's the story we were told. So what you see here is a need for a guild to tell a particular story to society. Now let's go a little bit real quickly through the corruption on this. And go back to the very first studies that we're going to have after DSM-3. And it's of a drug, alprazolam. You all know it's Xanax, right? And Upjohn wants now to get this approved for panic disorder, okay? A new diagnosis in DSM-3. It's really interesting. So what happens in the clinical trial? And by the way, although Upjohn is funding it, Gerald Claremont and others that are running this trial say, this is going to be done by us. We're going to design the study. We're going to be the ones analyzing the data. This will be us who figures it out. So go back to the studies. What do you find? It has two parts to it, because a benzo's known to be addictive. You have about an 8-week period of therapeutic care, and then people are withdrawn from the drug, okay? And now you read the studies, and their first abstract on safety and efficacy says, boy, this drug really works at 4 weeks. It does, much better than placebo. Now, what's the problem with that? It wasn't a 4-week study. It was a 16-week study. And at 8 weeks, the drug is in fact not much better than, it's not statistically significant better than placebo. And then what happens during the withdrawal? The drug withdrawn patients end up so much worse in terms of the number of panic attacks than the placebo patients. And they actually end up worse than they were at baseline. So why didn't we emphasize that? Well, we didn't, because that doesn't fit the story, and it doesn't protect, in essence, this new, the prescribing of drugs. 10 minutes, boy, I'm going way too long. Okay, my point is here, you can see this now, charting this time and time again. As they got information in their own studies that begin to belie, say, the efficacy of their drugs, that message is not communicated to the public. And you can do it with the SSRIs, the atypicals, and we can go forward with the STAR-D study, the TAD study, and time again, when you actually start digging into the study, you will see a different finding. And then you say, well, why did we get this other story that continually protects the image of the drug? Because they're protecting the image of a product. And I think we have to look at that. They can hardly imagine what is psychiatry going to go? You know what? See, our benzodiazepines are addictive. You end up worse off. Our SSRIs are really no better than placebo for most people. They can't do this. And there's this worry about increased chronicity. You can see, instead, what do we hear? You know what you heard when the SSRIs came to market? These drugs have a cure rate of 90%. The SSRIs. Now, the real data was they were hardly beating placebo, but cure rate of 90%. The only way you can understand is this within a context of a guild. And the point is this is in terms of this framework of institutional corruption. This type of behavior became normative within the institution. It became normative to spin results. You see it time and time again. And even the chemical imbalance story is a normative where they were telling a story that fit guild interests, but that was out of sync with the science. So the next thing you do is this. What's the social injury from this? Well, the first thing is the burden of mental illness since 1980 has gone up and up and up by every measure you look at. And by the way, it is going up in every society that has adopted this paradigm of care. That's the first thing. The second thing you start thinking about is this conception of mental illness, of so much as diseases. What does that do to us as a society? First of all, it's anti-democratic. It is anti-democratic because it starts saying some people are defective, other people are normal. You're making this division. Do you think it is good for social justice? Think about foster care kids. We all know what happened to foster care kids, right? They got a lousy deal in life. And we know what we say to the foster kids today? It's your fault. The problem's in your brain. You got bipolar, you need an antipsychotic. How about we talked about schools, ADHD. If it's the kid who's fidgeting's problem, it's the brain, we don't need to fix our schools, do we? So it's antisocial, it's antisocial justice, it's anti-democratic, and finally, it's an impoverished philosophy of being. To think that if you're fidgeting too much, or are you really never supposed to be anxious? You're really not supposed to grieve? We struggle with our minds. That's what we humans do. We struggle big time. And this is a philosophy of being that you're supposed to be happy all the time. You're not supposed to struggle growing up. The DSM reads like a book written by people who've never read Shakespeare, never read a novel. And this, I think, is part of the damage to us. Then the next thing is, why don't people see this within the institution of psychiatry? And the thing is, they've told themselves a different narrative. The narrative is a story of progress, of help, of, in fact, that we are making somehow great progress in uncovering the biology of mental disorders. And you really should listen to the annual talks by the presidents of the APA. It's always about a self-image of great scientists making great discoveries, serving the oppressed, and those who are against them are anti-science. And by the way, in Tuesday I gave a grand rounds at the University of New Mexico, and all I did was go over the long-term outcomes data for antipsychotics. So I go through that, and I go through like 30 studies, 35 studies. Some people weren't so happy, but the most interesting one was one by one of the older figures there. He said this: "You didn't present any evidence." I'm like, what did I do for an hour? And then my favorite was this. He said, "Listening to you is like listening to a talk about astronomy prior to Galileo." Now, I lost my temper a bit on this, but actually it's really revealing. You know the study of cognitive dissonance? People have self-images. A guild has a self-image. And if you come like me and say, hey, I think your drugs are actually increasing the chronicity of disorders, and frankly, you know, you've been telling us, you know, and you don't know the biology, you have a need to protect that self-image of yourself as a healer. So why is this important? If this institution of psychiatry is doing damage to us as a society as a whole, pathologizing children, you know, 25% of women on it. And by the way, Dr. Francis is right. It's a mess with the, quote, seriously mentally ill, too. Complete failure there, too. I agree. How can we reform that? What are the prescriptions for reform? And the first question is, can the guild reform itself? You can't see how they can, because they can't see the corruption. So I was at this fellowship with another person who looks at this, Lisa Cosgrove. She does some research on financial conflict of interest. And so we ended up writing a book on this. Psychiatry Under the Influence, it's titled. It'll be out in April. But the last thing is, what is the solution? And the only solution we could come up with is this. 5-minute warning. Okay. If you look at this history of the guild, you have the story of a medical profession that asserted as its domain authority over a large segment of our population, right? Not just the seriously mentally ill, but children, the walking wounded, etc. Now, why do they have that authority over that larger group? What is the legitimacy for that authority over kids that are fidgety? Or kids that, you know, foster care kids? It doesn't come from medicine, does it? I mean, it's sort of a power grab is what you see in 1980. So now let's take, I would say, for us, let's take psychiatry at its own word. They say we should have a biopsychosocial model, okay? So let's say, what does that mean? Well, we need some experts in biology. Okay, we'll give that to the psychiatrists. Are the psychiatrists, can they make a claim to being the experts today in the psychology of the human psyche? They can't. So now we need people that can lay some claim to having that expertise. How about social? Who has expertise in that? Again, that's not a medical thing, right? So I think the only real prescription for reform is this going forward. Since 1980, we've had one medical institution assert authority over a large domain of our society, one that even reflects and tells us who we are as human, what it means to be human. Free will questions come in this. We need to have a sharing of authority over this larger part of society, and that sharing of authority, I think, has to have personally, and I'm talking about how you start to construct diagnoses, or how you even construct who can get help and whether they need diagnoses, types of care, what we do for our children who are not doing well in school. We need a broad-based group of people. And maybe we need psychologists, and maybe we need social workers, and maybe we need some philosophers, people interested in childhood development. That's what we need, is if we're going to have a, quote, biopsychosocial model, then authority over creating that model has to be shared by a wider group of professionals. And so my final thing is this. Part of the wisdom and the expertise and the knowledge has to come from people who in one way or another have had struggles. Well, we've all had struggles, of course, but we have to bring in the voice of the voice hearing group, et cetera. And then you know what you have? You have a society that is trying to do best by itself in a large sense. And you have a group of people committed to building a more just society and a society that really, we've heard a lot about nurturing each other. And that could be a society, in fact, that becomes it. How do we nurture each other? How do we nurture our children? How do we care for the seriously, quote, the seriously disturbed? They should not be forgotten. But that's the only way we could come up with a prescription for reform, because reform, in fact, won't come just from within the guild. In my opinion, the institution cannot see itself in a manner that will allow for real reform. And I'll say this finally. I honestly can't think of anything more important for our society to do right now. What do we hear? You know, you go to colleges, like 20% of the kids now are diagnosed. Think about that. 20% of our kids are mentally ill by the time they're 20. It's ludicrous. And it's wrong, and everything is telling us that's not good for those kids long term. And then even in terms of like social justice, how we care for each other, what we do for foster care kids, it is a disaster. Our own internal sort of sense of self has been impoverished by this. And I do think we should rediscover Shakespeare and literature and all that as a way of what it means to be human. But this is what I think we need to go forward, is how do we as a society demand that actually psychiatry cede its authority over this large part of behavior, et cetera, and build a shared sort of sense of what to do about it. And anyway, so that's what, David, you asked for a sense of how do we go forward. I think this is hopefully this institutional corruption and gives us some sense of how we got here and how we might go forward. And finally this, is this a time, an opportune time? It is in this sense. Everybody basically will agree the promises of DSM-3, they have failed. Did we validate those disorders? We didn't. Okay, this is one of the ideas with DSM-3, their hypotheses. We'll do research that validates them. We've spent millions and millions of dollars searching for the brain, the problems in the brain. Has that done anything? Do we know anything in that brain? And by the way, you know the search for genes? That's not about helping patients. That's not about helping people. Stop, it says. That's actually about validating guild interests. And you know, of course, the rising burden. So if there's any time for society to rethink this, it's now, because the revolution in DSM-3 has failed. Thank you.